Okay, here we go. Hi, everybody. We're just going to give everyone a couple seconds here to join us before we start our presentation today. All right, it looks like we've got a couple people watching. So thank you for joining us. Today we have Chris Epes of Norfolk, who's going to talk to us a little bit about watering our vegetable gardens, which is kind of a funny topic considering how much rain we've had recently. But later in the summer, this is going to be super important information. And then next week, just to let y'all know, we have Evan, who is a new extension agent out of Roanoke, and he's going to be doing a session all about tomatoes and different common tomato diseases that you might encounter and how to keep growing your tomatoes disease and pest free so you have a good crop of tomatoes by the end of the summer. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Chris. And if you have any questions for Chris, you can type them in the comments throughout the presentation. I will be monitoring them, and then we will hopefully address as many as we can at the end.
Thanks, Devin. Okay, so I'm a bit embarrassed. This is not necessarily directly geared towards vegetable gardens, more so pots, but it also does apply, especially to raised beds and growing vegetables in containers. So I think we'll be all right.
That sounds great.
So my share screen. Okay, so today we're going to go over some watering basics, how to wet your plants. It seemed like as good a pun as any to use for this presentation. So a little bit about my background and kind of why I'm a little enthusiastic about this. Before I was an extension agent, I was a manager for a commercial greenhouse operation, and we had a lot of watering to do, needless to say. Part of my job routinely was training our seasonal hires how to water, and something in the neighborhood of a couple 100,000 containers needed to be watered on nearly a daily basis. The warmer it got. So watering container plants is kind of the gist of this video, but like I said a moment ago, the same concepts we're going to talk about, generally speaking, apply in the garden. So it'll be helpful in that regard. So I think one of the important things we have to remember here is that watering plants is a learned skill. And you'd be surprised how many times I get asked, how often should I water this plant? Or, it is not, what people need to understand is it is fundamentally not a very easy question to answer. It's a very complicated question because it's based on a lot of different variables. That for that reason, it's typically best learned by trial and error. It's definitely can be scientific. There are a ton of metrics out there that kind of explain how it's done and how to do it well, but it's also very subjective. Because it's based on so many different variables that we're going to talk about. It's based on plant response. It's based on what you want to get out of the plant, versus what someone else might want to get out of it could be different. So it can be very subjective. And for a lot of growers, especially experienced growers, you hear them talk about it as though it's kind of like an art form. And I've met a ton of professional growers who would hire people, and because of the subjectivity of it, they've refused to let anyone do it but themselves, which is a terrible burden. So if you can properly teach it to somebody, then it's probably best to kind of help take that burden off you. So where does one start? First and foremost, disavow yourself of this idea that you have a black thumb or that you're some kind of plant murderer. Come across tons of people who say that, but they literally just don't know the first thing about watering. It would be comparable to somebody, I like to use the analogy of like getting a dog and bringing it home and never feeding it. It's like, well, duh, you have to feed the dog, right? You can't just bring it home and not feed it and then say, oh, I'm terrible with dogs. It's like, no, you didn't find out how to sustain the thing, how to make it stay alive and how to make it grow up and healthy. Kind of same thing with plants. You just need to decide to pay attention to them and learn what makes them grow. And as far as watering goes, we'll use two basic rules here. And number one and number two are both things that are taught widely in any horticultural educational context. If you ask someone when to water, they'll say, water when the plant needs water. And what that means, well, it's obviously the more difficult of those two rules to grasp, but there's a very big emphasis of it depends on that. It depends on a number of different things. So if someone asks you when to water, you have to think about these multiple interdependent plant health variables that come into play. Depends what type of plant it is. Depends on the environment in which the plant's grown. It depends on the soil, the media in which the plant is grown, or if it's in a pot, it depends. Sometimes it depends what kind of pot or how big the pot is. Depends on the life stage of the plant, because different life stages require different amounts of water. Depends on the season, because plants have seasons where they grow more and seasons where they grow less and their needs are less. And like I mentioned before, it depends on the plant response that you're looking to achieve out of that. So describing when to water is generally not very straightforward. And the reason is because plants are living things. And like all living things, their needs change over time, and they change depending on the environment in which they live. So just remember that it is not an easy question to answer, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to teach. But we have the other rule, which kind of gives us a guide in what to do. It's like if the person who bought that puppy brings it home and somebody tells it, give 1 cup of food a day and a bowl of water. It's a start. It may not be exactly what the dog needs, but it's a start. And watering heavily and infrequently is like, that's where we start when it comes to how to water. So what that means is when you water, this box out of the way, when you decide to water, whether it be in the pots or plants in the garden, whenever possible, water as much as you have to fully saturate the soil, the media in which the roots are growing. The heavier that you water, the longer it's going to take for the soil to dry out, and the longer you have before you have to water again. Now, I have dry out underlined and starred because this is a very important concept that we want to remember. This process of that soil drying down is very important for root development, pretty much entirely critical for root development. So generally speaking, the soil becomes dry from top to bottom, gradually drying from the soil surface downward because of evaporation or roots near the soil surface pulling up water. I'm not saying that what's important is to be dry. What I'm saying, and this is critical, the process of drying down, that's what's important. I'm not saying that it's important to let the soil dry down and stay dry so that the plant wilts and everything goes haywire. No, I'm saying it's this process of the soil drying downward from the top, because the roots are going to grow from areas of dryness towards areas of wetness, and they will follow that moisture downward. And the deeper the roots develop, especially in the garden, the more access to relatively stable groundwater the plant's going to have, and that will mean that the plant will be able to go longer between watering. It'll become less dependent on your care, and ultimately that's what we want. We want plants that grow well without us having to work so hard to take care of them. And this concept, the water drying well from the top of the soil down, this is what we need to think of. If you're ever out shopping, I'm sure if you've ever been out shopping for plants and you've looked at a plant tag or a seed pack, it tells you that it wants well-drained soil. This is what it's describing, is a soil that dries well, not too slow and not too fast from top to bottom, that the roots can gradually follow down. And it's a soil that's not constantly wet, and it's a soil that's not constantly dry. So this is a GIF that Devin helped me make that more or less demonstrates what I'm trying to communicate. You can see that when the watering happens, the pot is fully blue, fully saturated, and over time it dries and the water level drops downward. And as it drops downward, those roots follow it. And this is kind of a good illustration of what we mean by infrequent heavy watering. When you water to complete saturation, and that will make it so it's not as frequent as it has to be, or it's not more frequent than it has to be. You're maximizing the amount of time between waterings. Now, the wrong way, one of those ways is to water too much. If you're watering all the time, then the soil is never going to dry out. And if the soil never dries out, it's going to remain wet all the time. And that is what the main thing that facilitates diseases, like fungal diseases that kill the roots, bacterial diseases, some kinds of insects like fungus gnats thrive on this, and you're going to get root rot. And subsequently, that'll stunt the plant. It'll cause wilting and the ultimate death of the plant. It's very, very bad for the plant. So you don't want to water too much. Again, you have to achieve that process of drying down in the soil. That's a picture of a poinsettia that has, I think it's Pythium root rot. And if you notice, it looks pretty similar to a plant that's wilted because it was dry. And that's something that you'll want to take note of. Whereas if you water too little, such that the root zone is never fully saturated and water never really drains from the pot, then of course you're going to get poor shallow root development, wilting, similar to that picture right there, stunting and decline, the eventual death of the plant. And if you don't water very much at any given time, you're going to have a shallow root zone, and that's going to mean that you have to water more often as well, because the plant's going to be more prone to drying out faster. The roots will. Those are pictures. That's a picture of peace lilies that have wilted because they haven't been watered enough. But again, I want to stress that both of those wilts, they look kind of similar. But you want to be aware that wilting is a consequence of both overwatering and underwatering. I'll explain that in a second. This is another GIF Devin made illustrating what happens when you only water shallow and infrequent, or shallow and frequent, like every so often, just coming by with maybe just a little cup of water and dumping it in there, or just, maybe with your watering can, you're just wetting the surface of the soil. This is essentially what you're going to see is root development that only happens near the surface, roots that aren't going down in the pot. And what you have is a plant that needs to be watered more and more and more and more and more. And you're setting yourself up for a situation where that plant probably is going to need to be watered every single day. Same goes for outside too. If you don't water heavily that soil surface, it's going to dry out very quickly. Your root systems are going to be very scraggly and close to the surface, and your plants are going to be more needy. You're going to have to water them more often. So, rule of thumb, I always try to communicate to my folks in the greenhouse was, until you know how often a plant needs water, always err on the side of dryness. And this is for a very important reason. A plant can typically bounce back a few times from a dry wilt. There's generally no coming back from a wet wilt. And that's because a wet wilt is almost always associated with a pathogen. Whereas a dry wilt is just, there's not enough water. So, you can't sustain that forever, but if you let a plant wilt a few times for lack of water, it'll keep hanging on for you. But if you overwater a plant such that you give it a root eating pathogen, there's generally no coming back from that. Like it's dead. Because fungal and bacterial pathogens, they thrive on moisture and they need it to survive. So that's another reason why allowing that dry down in your pot, being patient enough to allow that soil to dry out and then water again, it's a great form of pest or disease control as well. So that's why whenever someone didn't, whenever I had someone, I was training them how to water, I always told them, if you don't know whether or not to water, if you're looking at something and you don't know what decision to make based on the variables, based on the environmental factors at play, walk away and come back again a little later. Don't water until you know for certain that you need to. So I have 4 basic steps that hopefully will help you in the process of watering. The first one, of course, is water your pot to full saturation, like I said, such that the pot drains for at least a few minutes. And note how heavy the pot feels. This is a really important one because water is fundamentally heavy. If you have like 1 gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. So if you water your pot and the soil's totally dry, pick it up and feel it. Note how heavy it is. And then after you water it, after you've achieved that water draining from the bottom of the pot for at least a few minutes, walk away, forget about it. I know I've seen all these memes throughout the lockdown about people overwatering their plants because they're home all the time. Got to figure out a way to walk away and forget about it. Now, here's where it gets a little dicey because the question is, when do you come back? And this can depend on so many different things. Like if it's a small clay pot in a south-facing window, it may dry out in a day or two because it's a very small amount of soil. Clay absorbs water from the soil itself, so you have that to work against. Whereas if you have a large plastic pot in a north-facing window that doesn't get a lot of sun, it may take 2 weeks for that soil to dry out such that you have to water. You could be watering once a week and still overwatering. So it just depends. If you have a tomato in a patio container or a hanging basket on a sunny deck, I mean, if you had just planted that, it may take a week or so for it to dry out. But come summer in the heat of the day when it's full grown, you may end up watering that thing two times a day. So it depends. So you just have to kind of do your best by using a couple different steps. Watch for signs of drooping, of leaves drooping. And if the soil is dry and leaves are drooping, then you're okay. It means it's not a wet wilt. But if the soil is wet and your leaves are drooping, that is a bad sign. It means you are watering too much and you need to cut it out. Pick up the pot to gauge its weight. It should be quite a bit lighter. And a great way to do this as you learn is to kind of get an idea in your head of how much the pot weighs when it's wet versus how much it weighs when it's dry. And then that's a dead giveaway for you. And then you just count the days that it takes to get from heavy to light, and that's how much you water. Easy as that. Stick your finger in the soil to see how moist it is deeper in the pot. Remember, the soil dries from top to bottom. So there is going to be a point, excuse me, at which the top of the soil is dry and it looks dry and it looks like the pot may need water, but it doesn't because it's actually wet underneath or it's moist underneath. And a lot of people make the mistake of only using their eyes to decide when to water. So if you're watering as soon as the surface looks dry, it's likely you're going to end up overwatering. That's why you got to stick your finger down into the soil, stick it deep into the pot to figure out whether or not it's dry deeper in the pot as well. And if it is, then you can make the decision to water. But again, and I have to stress this, the same that I did with the folks that I trained, if you don't know whether or not to water, just step away, come back later. It's okay. Always err on the side of not overwatering. That's the way that I always try to teach it. And then when the plant begins to droop or the pot feels lighter, finger test tells you the soil is dry, deep in the pot, then water again heavily to full saturation and try to achieve that drainage that I talked about. So I want to talk about a couple things in regards to drainage. First is, of course, what I mentioned before, and that's root growth relative to the drying down process. Like roots will sort of, chase the moisture downward. You never, if you can help it, want to use a pot that doesn't have holes in it for drainage. Drainage is a critical part of the drying out process and a critical part of plant growth everywhere. That's why, like I said, almost all the plants you ever find says you need well-drained soil. Why that is, one of the things is what I talked about before, and that's just soggy soil can bring on pathogens. So if you have a pot that doesn't have holes in it and you're watering it over and over, that water has nowhere to go. Eventually you're going to get a disease in that pot and it's not going to take very long because it stays wet all the time. Additionally, in a lot of our water, even our treated water, a lot of fertilizers and in dirt, and a lot of our potting soil, because fertilizer is built into our potting soil all the time now. We have what are called soluble salts, and the topic of soluble salts is probably outside of the scope of this, but without a periodic flush from the system, without that draining, they're going to build up. And suffice it to say, that will cause plant health issues. It's going to cause issues with the pH of the soil, which will cause issues for the plant. So that flushing out process is very important to the health of the plant, not just the drying down, but the flushing out of soluble salts. When soils aren't allowed to drain, they become anaerobic, which is another word that means saturated with water and lacking oxygen. Another thing we need to remember is that plant roots breathe oxygen, kind of like we do, and they can't be exposed to just submerged conditions all the time. They have to have that pore space, and they have to have some dry space to breathe. And if soils aren't watered enough, and because of that don't drain, they can, on the complete flip side, they can become arid, like desert-like. And that's when they don't receive enough water to drain. So evaporation is the only form of soil drying. And when that happens, what happens with these salts is they get left behind and more concentrated as time goes on. And this picture right here demonstrates pretty well. This is pretty common for a lot of houseplants, is the white film that can sometimes build up on the soil of your houseplant pots. That's a pretty good indication that you're not watering enough to flush those soluble salts out, and they'll build up on the surface there. It's also a good indication you're not watering enough to achieve the proper drainage. So a couple other considerations. There is an exception for all of this with seed germination and seedling growth, and that's something that we need to address because it flips the whole thing on its head. Seeds, when you're germinating them, they must stay moist. And when you're germinating them, after they emerge, they're very, very sensitive to fungal pathogens. That's what's called damping off, is when a seed dies because of something right after it germinates. And for that reason, since it has to stay moist to germinate, but it's also very sensitive to moisture, that requires light and frequent waterings at the surface, just enough to keep that seed moist until it breaks free and opens up and emerges. And then you kind of transition to the heavy and frequent as it gets bigger. And then, like I said before, the same concept that we've been talking about outside of the seed germination, the same concept, heavy and infrequently, does apply to the garden and outdoor plants in the ground. However, there's one caveat there. Over time, plants in pots, if you do this well, they're going to get nice and big. Their root systems are going to establish well, and they're going to begin kind of displacing soil in the pot. As soil washes out during watering, more of the volume of the pot will be filled with roots than soil if you let this happen for a while. And over time, your plant will become more water needy. And it's going to, whereas it might have taken a week or two for your plant to dry out a year or so ago, now all of a sudden, like, okay, it's taken 3 or 4 days. And that's usually a good sign that it's time to repot. On the other hand, in the ground, in the garden, generally the opposite is the case. The larger your plant gets, the more the roots expand outward and downward, the less you're going to probably have to water, because the plant has more access to moisture in the ground that's kind of less likely to be evaporated because it's insulated. It's further down in the ground. So that's kind of your caveat there. So that is the end of my quick presentation. Devin, do I have time for the video, or should we just take questions?
Sure. If you want to play the video, that might give people time to type their questions in the comments. We do have a couple questions also, but if anyone has any more, you can type those in, and we'll watch the video, and then we can do some Q&A.
Let's see. So I'm just going to show a very quick video of me watering a houseplant. It's pretty straightforward, but it kind of provides a good idea of what I'm talking about when watering a pot to full saturation. So let's see. You seeing that? Okay. Hi everyone, this is Chris, talking to you about how to water your houseplants today. And this is just a video to kind of demonstrate what I've been talking about in my other videos about trying to get full saturation. This guy we potted up and watered about 2 weeks ago. It's at a point now where we are definitely ready to make a decision to water. Soil is dry up top, and when you put your finger in and dig around, it's still also pretty dry. And that should give you kind of an idea how long something like this takes to dry out. Although that is also a function of where it is. It's next to a west-facing window, so it doesn't get direct sun at all throughout the day. It gets indirect sun only in the latter part of the day when the sun is going down. So it took about 2 weeks to get to a point where it was dry. It's probably holds about 2 to 3 gallons of soil. So to kind of give you an idea. So we're going to water. This is my watering spot. The reason I do it in the tub is because, like I said in the other recordings, what you want to achieve is good leaching out of the bottom of the pot. And I know, if you're, conscientious, you may have little saucers underneath your house plants or something to catch water just in case water does come out. But when you're watering, you should be watering such that you're getting quite a bit of drainage. And a lot of times those saucers don't have enough room to catch all that water. So if you're not putting your pot somewhere where it can really leach out, like at the sink or maybe on a porch when you do water, you're probably not getting enough drainage to really serve the plant well and give it some longevity and healthy root growth. So for that reason, all our house plants, when we water, we put them in the tub so they can drain out, and then we put them back. And again, we do this maybe every week and a half, 2 weeks for all the plants that are potted in potting soil. So I will demonstrate. So I like to use a shower head like this because whenever you do water anything, pretty much a good rule of thumb is always to think about it like you're trying to replicate rain. Just having a faucet flow directly into your pot or using cups of water that can cause soil to disperse and can cause compaction and it can also make a mess. So it's possible to do that. You're probably not going to kill a plant if you do that, but the ideal scenario is you're trying to replicate rain. So this is why I have a shower head that is on a hose and can really break up the water. So what you're going to watch for is water with soil debris draining out of the pot down into the drain. When you achieve that, you're getting some good drainage. So the water level is dropping through the soil pretty well. Means I don't really have to stop doing this. But you see that? You see little bits of soil debris draining out of the bottom of the pot? So just because I see that doesn't necessarily mean it's time to stop, because you got to understand that the water is not just fully saturating all the soil at exactly the same rate of flow. There's still maybe little pockets within that pot that are still dry. So there's no reason not to just keep it going. Now, if the soil were so dry that when I was doing this, the water level rose up to the level to the lip of the pot, and soil were overflowing. I would just take the hose off and then put it back on. Typically, the way that I operate is when I have pots that do that, in order to achieve full saturation, I do that about 4 or 5 times. So I would say this is probably pretty good and saturated. And that's it. Now I just let it sit in the tub, let it fully drain out. Usually it takes maybe 20, 30 minutes, even longer if you don't have really anywhere to be. Upwards of an hour. By that point, most if not all the water will be completely drained from underneath the pot, and you're free to pretty much put it anywhere on a small saucer or whatever it is, and you will have minimal drainage out of the pot, and don't have to worry about water damaging your floor or furniture. Okay, that is it.
That was great, Chris. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions here. One, this is a pretty good question. Does the temperature of the water you're using make a difference?
Absolutely, yes, it does. Again, kind of reiterate what I said in the video about trying to replicate rain. You don't want it to be too hot. That can definitely damage roots and leave tissue. And you don't want it to be too cold either. I mean, I would say anywhere between 60, 70, 80 would be ideal, but 80 definitely would be getting up on the warm side. Plants aren't going to be too discriminate as long as it's not excessive. One thing you always want to watch out for, especially in the garden, if you have a long hose that's been sitting out in the sun and it hasn't been drained, when you turn that water on, let that hot water drain out first. Don't blast the plants with water that's been sitting in the hose and it's super hot. But generally speaking, any lukewarm tap water is perfectly fine.
Another question here. If you have a house plant and you are seeing that mineral or salt deposit on top, how should you fix that?
You can just scrape off the top, scrape that stuff off because it can be harmful to the plant. Maybe sprinkle a little bit of fresh soil on top to supplement, and immediately begin watering heavy because you want to flush that stuff out. So that's the important thing. It's usually a good indication that you're not you're not getting a good full saturation and drainage. So just transition to that and you should be fine. Should be perfectly fine.
And then do you have a recommendation for how to help a plant that might be suffering from root rot?
I have tried to rehab many plants that have been suffering from root rot. A couple of them, literally, I've had in my window and they've looked the exact same for 2 straight years before they bounce back. One of them, I had somebody submit a potted plant to my office for lab diagnosis, and it had a root rot on it. We got a sample sent off to the lab and everything. I asked them if they didn't want it back, and they said no. So I just left it in my office, and within a month, it had rebounded, just with good watering care that allowed the soil to dry out. I really think it depends on the vigor of the plant. It's pretty hard to predict, but good watering practices that allow the soil to dry out or dry out adequately before you water again is a great way to mitigate that disease. And maybe the plant will die. Again, that's a question that depends on how bad it is and the vigor of the plant, its ability to bounce back. But if you start watering well, such that it mitigates disease and keeps things a little dry in the pot, you can see how long you can take it. Like I said, I've had plants that have taken years, but they stayed alive and eventually bounced back. But that's kind of like I said, it's kind of why I said that when you get a wet wilt, that oftentimes there's no coming back from that. You just have to kind of call it quits and start over.
Another question, So how would you know when your plant has gotten too dry? And if you're doing the finger trick where you stick your finger in the pot, how far down should you be looking?
Uh, so that it kind of depends. For me personally, I've been looking at plants for so long, they definitely change color. And it may not be evident to someone who's not trained well or a lot of experience with it, but you can definitely tell the hue changes. It becomes a little bit less vibrant, a little less, a little lighter. Uh, the plant becomes a little bit less turgid, and it starts to droop just ever so slightly. I mean, the process of a dry wilt happens over a span of time. So if you're very observant and you watch it on the front, you can watch it start to droop a little bit. It may happen quickly, so you want to be on top of it. But at that point, and when you water, it'll bounce back and it'll be fine right at that point where it starts. So that's one way to tell. The dry soil, I would probably dig down. Of course, it depends on the depth of your pot. If you have a like a like a 2 foot deep pot and you dig down a finger length in the soil, that's not going to give you a very great indicator of how dry it is at the bottom. But if you have kind of any of your standard houseplant pots that are probably a gallon, 2 gallon, if you push down in the soil, probably up to your knuckle of your fist, and it's just as dry down there as it is at the surface, that is probably a good indication that it'd be time to water. But I would recommend trying to push it to the point, and I know this is kind of, I like to live dangerously. I don't know. Trying to push it to the point where you do see a little bit of that droop, because then you know exactly. And you just water, subtract a day off the interim between your last watering so it doesn't wilt. And then that's how you know when to water.
Okay, we have a question about how to water hanging baskets. So if you have a hanging basket that has that kind of like permeable liner thing, do you have recommendations for watering that? And then someone wants to know if submerging it in a bucket of water is an appropriate way of watering.
Sure. Yeah. Submerging in the bucket of water would be fine. You'd only want to do it for as long as it takes for the soil to be saturated and then pull it out. But hanging baskets are a little bit of a different beast because they're more exposed. And by definition, that means they're gonna dry out faster. Since they're up in the air, the sunlight that hits the side of pots, that can facilitate faster drying because it heats up the soil. And it increases the likelihood of drying, kind of like an oven. So it's subtle, but if your pot is hanging up and the whole thing is getting sunlight around it, it is going to dry out a little faster. But the same principle applies for hanging baskets as pots on the ground. Heavy, full saturation. But when those hanging baskets get big and the plant gets nice and big and grown, and that root system takes over that basket, you watch out, because on those hot summer days, you're going to be watering that thing twice a day for sure. So you just have to be mindful that, like I said, when those root systems get big and they take over that pot and they displace a lot of soil, plants can get pretty needy.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions on here. I think we have time for one more. So if we don't get to your question in the video, I will go back through and try and address the ones that we haven't talked about and direct you to resources that can help. So I think for our last question is about fertilizing. So if you're going to fertilize an outdoor potted plant or your garden or something, it's good to water after you fertilize. Is it okay to fertilize right before it's supposed to rain, or should you fertilize and then control the exact amount of water your plant is getting by watering yourself?
Yeah, it would be best if you can help it to not fertilize right before a big rain, because you don't want that rain to wash that stuff through the soil. However, if it's a slow release, a dry fertilizer formulation, a lot of times that stuff is activated by rain. So you do want, if that's the route you go, then it is good to do it right before rain.
Okay, so it kind of depends on the fertilizer you're using.
It does. It depends on the fertilizer. Obviously, read the label. Any product you use, almost always the label will tell you exactly what to do and avoid, what to avoid.
Okay, well, that was great, Chris. Maybe that explains why I've killed so many potted plants. This was a super good presentation. Next week, we're going to have Evan O'Neill, who's the extension agent in Roanoke, talk to us all about tomatoes. So different diseases to be aware of, cultural practices to get the best crop out of tomato plants. So you can come back next Thursday at 2, same thing again. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And we hope to see you next week.
Thank you.